Do you have any hope that like Russians and Ukrainians can live in peace in the future?
Depends on what time period you look at.
I mean,
Eventually, yes.
Yeah.
But I think most people on both sides, especially the Ukrainians, won't be able to imagine that at the moment, I think. So if we look at history, if history can be any guide, I think looking at how other European nations or citizens interact with Germans, for instance, or if you look at some of the positive signs in the Balkans, although there are many negative ones at the moment, I think there can be some glimpse of hope or some optimism. But I think it's a very long road.
Of course. I also think it's a long road, but it's like the horizon that's important to keep in mind, because I think eventually that should be an end goal, or this should be some sort of like a real, almost like not a dream, but something like that people should strive to achieve from international relations perspective. Because of course now everything, like all the discussions, they kind of go into this direction of who wins the war, which, I mean, of course, if you are very if you support one side, of course, you're going to have one type of answer. If you support another side, you have another type of answer. So it's like a very polarizing question, very polarizing like answer and thinking. But if you think about how do you make a long-term benefit for both sides, for both Ukrainians and Russians, and I mean, I also talk in the sense of Russian people and Ukrainian people, you really need to think about how do you make them live together peacefully, or how do you ensure that those nations live together in peace? Because I think the problem that we can encounter, and I guess some experts definitely raise this problem, that you could have like a very long-term conflict, even if you have some type of peaceful agreement or some ceasefire, you will have the comeback of over and over and over and over again. Because of course there are not so many examples in history of this type of conflict. Some people may bring, like, North Korea, South Korea, the way it can eventually be resolved short term. But of course, when I look at European history, to me, the example of course, Germany and France is a staggering one, because those were the nations that quite fought each other for more than 100 years.
But I mean, of course, I think the analogy of Germany and France is difficult for two reasons. First of all, it is a very long history. At the same time, it is one that luckily ended in 1945 and hasn't, erupted again.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think it didn't cost that many lives. So I mean, and especially in the First World War rather than the Second. Yeah. I mean, I'm not intending to downplay that many French people killed, but I mean, if you look at the Second World War, I think the way the war was fought in the East and the way the war was fought in the West still is different, or was different. So I mean, in that sense, and if you look back at times of the arch enemy France, or vice versa, the arch enemy Germany or Russia, or the German Reich, I think that was also when you had a lot of standing armies and when battles were fought on the battlefield and not that many civilians were harmed. So I think war is taking place on a larger scale. There are all kinds of theorists of war who say that the way that wars have been fought has changed or changed with the First World War, because at that time, it started to become total, and also one that did many more loss of life, so a destruction of infrastructure, harm to the civilian population, starvation, what have you. So it makes a difference also for reconciliation. And I mean, talking about Ukraine and Russia and the time horizon, I think the trends that we're seeing at the moment, of course, are not very reassuring, because what we see is, I think, an even stronger bifurcation or confrontation that takes place, where you have a North Korean leader coming to Moscow, which of course is a strong signal that there is something like a pivot to, if you will, or as some called it, a new axis of evil that is forming. And I mean, as such, even if we think of a post-Putin Russia, we will have to see how this trend towards rather orienting the country towards Asia, towards China, towards Korea, towards other countries, sort of detaching it from the West, what kind of impact that will have. And I think that's an open question. So at the moment, we are seeing, besides all the horrible effects of the war as such, we also see many trends that pull Ukraine and Russia in different directions, also geographically. Of course, that's a big open question how that will turn out. And of course, then we have other aspects of theories of peace. What you refer to as a ceasefire is, of course, can or could be described as peace. There are all sorts of ideas of a positive peace, of a negative peace. I mean, is it simply the absence of war, a peace, or is that something comprehensive? So, I mean, I think there is a lot of, things unpack and a lot of aspects that politicians on all sides to reflect when they move along and try to maybe forge ties, try to forge compromises, if there are the possibilities of forging those compromises.
Yes, I think one thing to notice that I still think, despite the current trends in like, let's say, Russian foreign policy, and despite current trends, even in geopolitics as such, I think it's impossible to erase Russia from the European map. And what it means, like just in essence, that I don't really envision Russia being absent from like European. I mean, you could say security architecture, you can say European order or something like that, just because it's very artificial. And even if to bring some recent news that said that now Russian cars are prohibited to enter European Union. They just don't allow them to travel to European Union. And of course, it causes like problems for people who, maybe are used to traveling back and forth from Russia to Finland, from Kaliningrad to Russia, crossing Baltic states and stuff like this. But in a sense, what I try to think about a lot is how you can really ensure that Russia and Ukraine have more or less peaceful coexistence. And for me, the thing that comes to my mind is, of course, like the idea of some kind of expanded European Union, or some type of, if we talk about maybe security, some type of reorganized NATO arrangement. Just because it's hard to imagine that you really can sustain peace without incorporating both Russia and Ukraine into one space, so to speak. I would call it just space because, again, space that they can really coexist. And of course, like for me, the example of Germany and France is really important because even I don't know, in 30s, it would be hard to imagine that Germany and France would ever live peacefully together. And I think there is still some strain, right, between Germany and France, not in the sense of on the political level, but you could definitely see that culturally, those countries are very different. And German people and French people, it doesn't seem that they're very interested in each other, which is noticeable when
decreasingly so. If you look at figures like the number of people who take German or French classes, the number of exchange students, the number of, those jumelages, those are those twinnings between different, cities and the interest. That is something where you see a decrease. That's correct. At the same time, of course, there are no tensions in the sense that someone in France or in Germany of the right-wing parties would say, we should invade our neighboring country, meaning France or Germany. So that's luckily, or that's fortunately, a thing of the past.
I think, of course, on the political level, there is a big alignment going on, especially on elitist levels. We see all these Franco-German cooperation agreements. We see all this like attempts to bring elites closer together, to have those like exchanges. And I think like more or less, I mean, I'm not an expert, but if you look at German elites, they most of them speak some French, and it's kind of I believe their work in for maybe European type services, they have European type of ambitions. That's all good, but like still in a sense, the fact that people themselves do not really pay that much attention to their close neighbors, it also shows you there is some history there, right? There is some complicated history, because it's also, because why is that? Like, why people who live so close together, who are, nominally like kind of best allies in the world, these like people of those countries, they tend not to get that much interested in each other. I mean, it just there is still some history there, so to speak, right? And to me, it's extrapolating this onto like Russia-Ukraine type of conflict. It's good to think long-term perspective, in a sense. How do you really reconcile them, and how do you really get through this animosity, so to speak, in a long term? And of course, there's something that's to my mind is this idea of some kind of common space, because common space ensures that you build some type of trust.
What do you mean by the space? Is it something like an economic space? Is it trading? Is it an sort of academic space? Say there is some like academic collaboration. Is it really a geographical space that you say there is, for instance, the currently sort of invaded or occupied Ukrainian territory held by Russian forces, and there could be some kind of, I don't know, referendum or political state that these areas are neither Ukrainian nor Russian? Or what kind of space are you thinking about?
Space just in the sense, the territory that doesn't really have any border, so to speak. So people from Moscow can go to Kiev, from Kiev can go to Brussels, whatever. Some space that. Of course, something like that comes to my mind is European.
Frankly, EU enlargement.
Yes, exactly. In a way, but I think the EU enlargement. For this to happen, the EU itself has to be, of course, rearranged, right, in some that type of way, because you couldn't imagine this type of enlargement right now. But again, coming back to the example of Germany and France, of course, you have, if you think about through history, how EU project started is through a coal agreement, right? And why is it so important? Well, coal agreement and the area of how they call it, like Alsace,
yeah,
and they thought for this area for so long, and then eventually, now it's. When you even go there, of course, it's old German type of territory. You could see it in terms of names.
Depends. You mean Lithuania used to be German at some stage, yes.
They have old names in German, and it does feel like it's more German than French, but yet it is a French. But does it really matter now? Not really, because you live in the same type of economic space. So this is what comes to my mind. This is important to think through, because I don't see any other long-term solution. Because of course you could say, well, we want to bring. If you like scrutinize like the perspective now, and I don't think actually the West has any long-term solutions or has any long-term strategy. So they also do whatever they have at hand, because like if you look at their long-term strategy, it's like what make Ukraine win, which is a little bit cynical, because I guess people in Washington and Brussels understand that it's not happening, that they're not getting back Crimea anyway. So eventually they have to compromise something, and in a sense, like unions, like territorial integrity, whatever you call it. So, which means that they have to compromise, and the compromise means that they have to come up with some type of solution where Ukraine is satisfied with the compromise. So
then the question: does compromise actually lead to a lasting peace? or is it just the start to a new round of conflict? So I mean,
yeah.
So maybe there are some things where you can draw on a historic analogy, maybe also to the Versailles Treaty and things like that. At the same time, I'm a bit skeptical. I think one of the, maybe in hindsight, advantages of the German-French situation was that they were more or less, at the same level in terms of power, landmass, more or less. So I think the asymmetry in terms of the power relations between Ukraine and Russia are way more pronounced. So, I mean, if you look at the population size, if you look at the size of the territory, if you look at all of those aspects, I think the possibility of a peace agreement or of some kind of stability maybe was easier to achieve. But German-French relations at the same time, that's a very, say, a kind of balance of power or equilibrium thing where you just look at figures. Because of course there are also other factors. So I mean, there are relationships like the Canadian-American one. There has been peaceful coexistence, even if this one country is significantly larger than the other and could technically invade the other one without much of a problem. So, I mean, in that sense, there are, of course, other elements to that as well. But I think it will be complicated. Of course, also it needed the entire, or it needed the surrender of Germany and basically the entire occupation of Germany to rebuild it after the Second World War. So, I mean, of course, we all know that's off the table. There will be no way that, tanks will roll into Moscow and that the regime will be toppled, that there will be a new democratic regime to be established. So, I mean, I think it all hinges on in what direction Russia will develop and in what way also political developments will more or less move in parallel, or at least not in opposite directions in Kyiv and in Moscow. And I mean, that's of course a big question. Coming back to your aspect of a EU argument or anything like that, of course, that's a far cry, and that's a sort of a very long time horizon there. So I mean, but really, the question maybe we shouldn't think about historical analogies that much, because maybe they might reduce our creativity, or maybe they actually make us think in ways that are not only not allowing for certain possibilities, but maybe they're also detrimental to our creativity of finding a solution. I mean, and I mean, if you look at what apparently some psychologists and researchers in trauma and those aspects found out, is that, of course, the physical and psychological scars of warfare that is fought at such a scale has a massive impact on the population. So if one draws apparently the evidence from the Balkan Wars, you see that especially the population that lived through the wars, I mean, doesn't relive those kind of period again. So I mean, you really have to invest a lot into propaganda in order to continue fighting those wars, and you also have to look at the youth, something like school curricula that will eventually prevent that countries are going to war again. And I mean, there I'm very skeptical, because I mean, everything that I hear from Russia is not very reassuring, because I mean, what they're basically seem to do is trying to force young kids to believe in the grandeur and the importance of Russia fighting for it militarily, and also getting indoctrinated that, I mean, a lot of countries are trying to conquer the country or something like that.
Yeah, but it's also easily reversible, because for Russia it's a little bit of a distant war. For Russians, it's a distant war. I mean, they don't really recognize it as a total national conflict. I mean, because the whole concept with it's still called actually special military operation, is to show the distance from people, so to speak. So there is some, and I guess it's like one thing that is really important in the future and I guess for people like me, for people, experts who live abroad, for Russians who live abroad, is to really argue that there's no connection, or to disconnect, so to speak, Russian people from Russian government, in the sense that it's conducive for meaningful peace in the future. And like in German case, of course, the answer was clear that there was a Hitler regime and they were German people, and the connection was made to like the idea to punish only people who belong to Hitler regime. Nuremberg process, was of course productive for future peaceful development, so to speak. And now, of course, Germany has a complicated history, but at least, even among European nations, people don't look at Germans as some weird people who are different from other European nations. But there are a bunch of arguments floating around that Russians are very special type people, and maybe it's forever with them and stuff like this. So of course it's also the result of work to be done on this front to really argue that Russian culture has nothing to do with Putin. Russian people really, it's all about mainly propaganda and stuff like this, and as such I think it's really reversible in the sense. For Russia, it's a distant war. Of course, the question on Ukraine is much more complicated because for Ukrainian it is. I assume is a total war.
It's about a state of. It's a war about the survival of the state. Of course, it's a war that basically affects everyone. if you see that, even if you live close to the Romanian border, or if you live close to the to the Polish border, your house can be hit pockets. It's of course there is something that's happening immediately at the front line, where also people are evacuated, where they flee their homes. But if as such, of course, there are also some minor attacks on Russia. But I think the scale is just very different.
No, it's still, in the Russian case, it's still very distant conflict, which is, of course, in a sense surprising, but this is also the way Russian government manipulates society. It's just, all duplicity is, of course, intentional. It is intentionally a national conflict and distant conflict at the same time. So Russian government can use it, can basically leverage it in its own purposes, masterfully, of course. But with the Ukrainian in the Ukrainian case, it's way much more obvious that, of course, the trauma is there, and for people, it would be way much harder to forgive than Russian people, Russian people, because for them, they don't really disconnect again Russian regime from Russian people. But actually, it's important then maybe to bring this, what I already said, in a sense of to disconnect regime from Russian people, because it's actually the argument that Russian people are equal to Russian regime. It's very prominent in Ukraine. Understandably so. But then again, it's then important to argue back, because for me, again, this is such an obvious thing that there is really no connection between government and Russian people, even though statistically,
only to a certain extent, of course. If you mean one mustn't equate the Russian people with the Russian regime, yes, absolutely. Yes, some are indoctrinated. The question is there some kind of self-reflection? The fact that many people left the country, I think, also shows that the propaganda is not working for everyone, or that some see through that, or also notice it. And of course, it comes with a lot of hardships to leave the country. Economic-wise, or in other respects. So, of course, this idea that some people say, why are people, flooding Red Square or others in Moscow and bring the regime, and then, you have a democratic Russia. I think that's also, in a way, unfortunately, wishful thinking and a bit naive. But because there are many ways that the Russian government can crack down, can put people into prison, and of course that makes it difficult for people to revolt or go out on the streets. And that's maybe there is an analogy there to the Third Reich, right? So that in hindsight, people said, people were afraid to say something, and I mean, then there is a certain stage when it's too late. So I mean, there would have been a way when people might have stood up and said, enough is enough, but in that sense, it's a slippery slope, and things are getting worse by the day. And I mean, I think that's something we do see, and that's of course terrible.
And then I guess that's the question of responsibility, because, and then coming back to this idea of like the difference between the Reich and Russia, we assume, you know, Russia won't be conquered, but, you know, I mean, actually, I think that's why I would argue that there is a necessity to disconnect this idea of peace from like developments in Russia. I would say mainly because, I mean, of course, you don't know what type of developments you have in Russia, but if you have a certain understanding of how you can build a peace, in other words, how you can like really try to have some peaceful arrangement where, you know, Ukraine and Russia can exist peacefully without future wars. You need to think beyond this idea of what type of regime you have in Russia, because you could have something like technocratic regime in Russia that comes to power, and, you know, it talks to, like, you know, people in Brussels, and you need to have people in Brussels should have some idea what can we offer to them, because I mean, I can imagine a scenario where they, you know, sent to jail. I mean, let's say it's new technocratic regime, and let's say it's even autocratic. I mean, it's not like that rare in history when the West cooperates with autocratic regimes, but they can send to jail, let's say, all people. It's like Putin type, something like this. That's some wishful scenario, but still. And they send to jail everyone who, like, maybe participated in the Putin regime, or except for, you know, the way they did with Third Reich, people who like did like finance and stuff like this. And if you have some type of idea to pitch to a new Russian government, where, you know, they solve the problem they solve the problem, so they kind of like show the road that they can take. Maybe they can take this, so to speak. Maybe they can take this scenario and work with it. But if you have any type of scenario, then of course you have a problem, because then you don't really think, I mean, politically in long-term perspective. I mean, this is what I want to argue, but I guess it's also important just to bring this just to the discussion, so to speak. I understand that it's not an issue that can be solved anytime soon, but at least if you just, you know, have a seed in someone's, that this is important to think through, maybe that can lead in the future, in the 2030 or something.
Well, I think it's there with some exiled Russians, and then the question is, if you look at the recent history or conflicts that ended, there was never or rarely the case that you had someone who was exiled who sort of returned, and then maybe some could say he was exiled, but he was sent into prison like Nelson Mandela, and then, you know, becoming the president of South Africa, and then, you know, starting a sort of new page or new chapter in South African history. But of course that was not really a question of warfare, and it's in that sense it's not a good historic analogy. But I mean, if you look, for instance, at anything that has happened in Syria, and anything that has happened in Iraq, in anything that has happened in Afghanistan, I mean, you couldn't something like an exile or government in exile that eventually took over, and then everything, you know, became better. So I mean, if the countries are stable at all, or if there's some kind of peace, I mean, it was because of some other kind of, you know, arrangements or power. I mean, even arrangements.
In the Russian case, I think it's obvious that there is some pendulum swing. I mean, after Putin, you can with some certainty that there's going to be democratization in Russia. What is democratization that is?
Because you mean the situation is so bad that it cannot get worse?
No, I mean just looking through, just again having a historical lens here. Like, for example, after Stalin, you had democratization with Khrushchev. After Brezhnev, you had Gorbachev. Even after Yeltsin, first Putin was, I mean, it wasn't democratic, but you still see this pattern that after like a strong leader, there is a pushback. And I mean, it's also maybe, I mean, the way I can argue that, like, why American system is so good, because it allows this pendulum swing to work institutionally, right? You have left and right, so to speak, and then they kind of like change their change their spots, and then they take responsibility, and then they kind of rule the country. So if you can have the same type of system, maybe it would be just beneficial for Russians to have this type of system where you can have more or less autocratic change, or more or less autocratic regime followed by some, not regime, but some type of like party followed by more or less democratic one. So because even if Putin, like, for example, I mean, one thing is certain, that after Putin you will have a type of regime but more democratic leader, and in a sense, like, you will have like a pushback even from elites, because I mean, again, Putin is an extreme type of scenario, and of course now with all his deeds, so to speak, you could definitely see that he moved like way much closer to like full-blown dictatorship. It's hard to imagine that like after him they're going to be a person who is even more ruthless, but it's also who has actually that much authority, because Putin, like, the way he didn't really had that much of authority when he became the president, but he collected it step by step. And he also, I mean, has some type of legitimacy in a sense, because Russian people like trust him. But again, I wouldn't really blame Russian people, but he is the master of basically mass manipulation. He knows how to manipulate people. He knows what to sell to them, and how to tap to this Russian psyche, and the psyche of people who, were raised in Soviet Union with this idea that they're unique, that they're like the only ones who can fight capitalism, the US, blah blah. But he did. He hijacked this limbic system. I don't know, like their whole mentality, and now you have.
But I mean, if we try to unpack that, I mean, maybe we come back to 2 points that you made. Yeah. So one was, we talked a lot about the French-German history, recent last 2 centuries, and try to use that as an analogy, so that it didn't really get us that far. You also mentioned the Koreas as an example. Of course, that might be an other interesting thing, because I mean, everything you said, I mean, being optimistic that the next leader of Russia after Putin will most likely, not be as terrible, which I mean doesn't mean a lot. Okay, might give us a little of hope, but of course, first of all, then say it's up, of course, to the Ukrainians then to decide. Well, even if there is some kind of offer on the table, or if you have sort of an open hand or whatever you call it, that I mean there is say a Russian initiative or Russian efforts to, reassure or to do confidence-building measures with Ukrainians. There is, of course, the question whether, I mean, you will buy into that, will actually cooperate or take up that offer. So, I mean, that's a first question. And so, I mean, if our focus is here on peace, on stability, or end of conflict, I think there are indeed 2 scenarios. One is technically there would be a Korean style arrangement, but that would basically mean the ties between the countries are severed. And I mean, if there is some kind of ceasefire, there will be also something like a demilitarized zone, and otherwise the Ukrainians and Russia will most likely not increase, but rather decrease or basically come to a standstill. Now, I think this analogy doesn't bring us that far, is that European history is different. So I agree with that. And Russia has always played a very complicated part in that European history. The same goes for Germany. And at the same time, I think the picture is more complex because it involves more players or more countries. So I think if we now look at what is happening in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is somewhere down to the south, where we see that basically the Azeri government is starving Armenians. If we look at what's happening also in terms of nuclear arms that are being shipped to Belarus, we see that it is not about Ukraine and Russia versus NATO countries or the West, because I mean, as such, it is more complex, because we also have to bring Belarus in the equation. So I think in that sense, we have Kaliningrad, we have a very, very delicate, also geographical situation that makes it more difficult to actually achieve something like a DMZ in the Koreas, because I mean there it's a sort of clear-cut borderline. There it is more or less stable. Of course, what we see is the North Korean regime is completely disconnected from anything that happens in Korea and South Korea. And if there are ties, they exist with regard to Beijing and China, but it's more or less a completely isolated regime. And as such, we won't see that for Russia, because I mean it's also it's more powerful in terms of the economy. The question is, what will it look like? Is it what sort of? It will most likely be between the two poles and extremes. So I mean, Germany, France. It also won't be like the Korea. So the question is, how will that look like, and how will it look like in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, and 40 years?
Yeah, I guess two comments. The first one is actually, if you think about DMZ, I don't think Ukrainians would subscribe to that either, because DMZ means that they know, let's say, they settle now with borders they have now. And it basically means Ukraine will never get back those territories, right? I mean, factually, because DMZ means it's a frozen conflict for 40 years or whatever. So I don't think Ukrainians will subscribe to this either. So it's not beneficial for Ukrainians, because they're going to lose 25% of their territory. I mean, I don't think it's the best type of scenario even for them. And of course, what you said, the second point, is this idea that this is more or less European security conflict, or you can say it has European security conflict dynamic. It's more than just conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It's conflict between Russia and the West, or you can say it's conflict between Russia and NATO countries, or you can say, well, but it has this dynamic that is just bigger than the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And that's why the solution to it would also require some type of rethinking of European security architecture, or rethinking of how those nations live together, so to speak. It's the same way to say rethinking European order. Of course, this is something that the West is really against, because for them it means, because in their worldview, the order that exists now, it is beneficial for them. So there is to change it, they don't really want it.
You're not talking about the Russians.
No, I mean the West itself. So because from their, what I can see, of course, their dynamic and how they think about it is just Russia is not part of the Western order, and that's it. Or it's something that is actually as an enemy to the Western order. So they exclude Russia, and they want to make this to make this conclusion that Russia is not part of the West. Russia is not part, because for the West and Europe, it's kind of the same thing. So they want to make this conclusion that Russia is not part of the West. If anything, Russia is an enemy to the order. So, if Russia wants to go Asia, but just leave us alone. And,
Well, that's also something that you hear from Moscow.
Yeah.
I think in that, I'm not sure whether it's not also an assessment of decision makers in Brussels, be it in NATO headquarters or in the EU, who just are careful observers of what is happening in Russia. And of course, there is more of a reorientation towards Asia, all the rapprochement towards China. And maybe we haven't discussed the sort of real elephant in the room, because we are geographically too limited when we look just at Europe itself. Because I think what this war also represents is, and what is repeatedly being said by Putin and also by Xi and others, is that we're seeing something like the decline of the American unipolar moment. We see this new multipolar order. If that is also what the Ukrainian war is about, multipolarity, a new multipolarity. Of course, decision makers in Washington and Brussels or Europe will have to think about what role they play in that multipolar order, and what the rules of the game will be for such a multipolar order. Because there is if we look at the way that the G20 summit played out, if we look at the way that G7 tries to counter the Belt and Road Initiative, if we look at the BRICS summit, and then also the idea of enlarging the BRICS. I mean, do see, of course, quite obviously that things are not necessarily falling apart, but I mean that there are new dynamics at play, and there are new kind of alliances that are, taking shape. So I mean, there are those actors or countries such as Brazil and India or Turkey. I think they sort of cooperate or play this kind of game, if you want to refer to as a game, in a way that they align very flexibly or very pragmatically with people, depending on whether it's sort of in their military, in their geopolitical, economic, whatever interests. And at times they can confront Russia, at times they can accommodate Russian concerns or even cooperate with Russia. So I think in that sense, we are currently a situation where also everything that has been referred as the new multipolar order or multipolarity, I mean, also plays out in Europe. So I mean, if we just look at it in isolation, I think we might overlook something, or we might actually not take into consideration some of the dynamics that are at play.
Yes, and
maybe you're not convinced.
No, I mean, in a sense, there is like this grand geopolitical layer to the conflict itself, or to the spat between like the West and Russia. I mean, obviously, and also, of course, the West. I mean, they don't recognize it in the official rhetoric, but it seems, the West tries to protect international order, while anyone, like almost everyone except for the West, sides with Russia, but at least they don't really care about the international order that the West represents anymore. So they kind of like, they're okay with whatever type of order like Russia and China trying to, like, multipolar order trying to create. And yeah, I think this dynamic is certainly important. But what I try to think a lot, again, but it's also, it's very interesting to bring this into perspective or into thinking. But what I try to think about is still this idea of, but how can you make some peace, like, in a sense, or how can you really ensure that they live like peacefully together, or how you can like any progress on this front. Because it seems like, for now, of course, it seems, almost impossible to have a type of peace agreement. But I don't really think it can last forever, like for 30, 40 years. But then, of course, for me, so it's also the question of the dynamic seems so unnatural, because this geopolitical game that really divides European continent, which means, for me personally, right, from a very human type of perspective, like the idea that Russian people cannot travel to Europe is obnoxious. I mean, it's really unnatural, because the flow of capital, the flow of resources, the flow of human capital, including human capital, is supposed to be, it's supposed to be kind of open. And I guess naturally it tends to like move into the direction of this openness, because you have like exchange of ideas, you have exchange of people, you have exchange of blah, blah, blah. And this is very unnatural the way it develops now. So the way that, we close like Europe from Russians, but at the same time, we want to open to Indians and, South Americans. Yes, I mean, of course, like I could see this as a like short-term strategy, but I don't think it's sustainable for 30 years. Again, what we discussed.
It's something that happens during wartime. So I mean, you have all those figures, for instance, that the level of connectedness, the level of sort of globalization that was in place or was achieved shortly before the First World War, and that was sort of cut off or interrupted because of the First World War, and was only achieved again in the 2000s. I mean, it's something that happens in war times. Borders are closed, the exchange of population is reduced. Of course, when Germans fought in the First and Second World War, I mean, exactly that happened. And I mean, the question then is was something is untrue? We'd say, I mean, it's something that shouldn't happen because I mean, just the kind of results are just so horrific that I mean, we should try our best to ensure that wars are not occurring, or if there are other ways of conflict resolution, that they should implement it. But I mean, as the reaction, to me, I think sound pretty reasonable, even with a country that the Europeans are not at war with and have been holding talks for decades now, like Turkey. We have more or less the similar regime in terms of not migration, but I mean visa regime. I mean of having hurdles to enter the country, and of course it's very asymmetric because I mean if I want to travel to Turkey, I can basically enter the country and get my visa upon arrival. That's different for Turkish people coming to Germany. So I mean if we say that these should be sort of more streamlined, identical, or more less symmetric, yes, I mean, it's something we can discuss, but I mean, at the same time, I also see that it is difficult to have this. I mean, if you cut off, officially at least, economic ties with Russia, that you have a decrease in trade, you have a decrease in imports and exports. It's also, I think, not surprising to see that also the exchange of people also is reduced.
The question is whether it's I mean, I guess the better way to frame it, whether it's something that in the West you eventually want to really have this type of like world order where you have this strong differentiation between the West vis-a-vis the rest. Because what actually synthesizing maybe what we discussed, of course, the idea that Russia is not really isolated, it's important to bear in mind. In a sense, it also shows like it's
only isolated from
the West. Exactly, which also shows the constraints of the Western power itself, because it's not really possible to isolate a country like Russia, right? It's, of course, they managed to isolate, let's say, Iran or North Korea, but with Russia, it's too big, and it's also you can say like globalization made things impossible. Like globalization made this type of arrangement. It's impossible to isolate Russia, right? Because it's already too well connected to other countries. It's very well connected to China. It's very well connected to India. It's very well connected even to South America or to Africa. So, I mean, of course, like you can inflict pain, but then is this something that you want long term? Because for me, what I said before, and what I think I argue that it's like the West actually doesn't have long-term strategy. Like all of their actions, they're like just short-term reaction type of.
But how can you know that there is no long-term strategy?
Because
my guess is, I mean, you will in Brussels, you will find people at least who have something, on their hard disks or otherwise on their shelves where they have a sort of short-term, medium, and long-term strategy. Yeah. And I'm pretty sure that there is a long-term strategy, or at least idea, concept to sort of include Russia in whatever kind of future arrangement. And of course, that's very, very down the line. So I mean, the short-term thing is, or as such, we need to imagine that there are two sides that also need to signal that they are interested in a rapprochement, if there is something like a ceasefire at the end. So I mean, I also see that, structurally speaking, the likelihood that there will be some more of an initiative by Europeans rather than the Ukrainians is something that is also pretty understandable, because I mean, first of all, there is a more institutional logic to the one that is playing out in Brussels, and at the same time, of course, while Europe or the West is supporting Ukraine, are not technically a conflict party on the battlefield. So as such, I think for the Ukrainian, it's at this stage way more difficult to imagine for most Ukrainians, I guess, so for almost all Ukrainians to imagine something like a, future types of collaboration, peaceful coexistence with Russians. So it will have to involve the two sides. I mean, there will have to be signs by Russia, and there will have to be signs by Brussels. And I mean, of course, the question is in a way something very human. So I mean, who sort of takes the first step? I mean, or what the kind of, how can one side actually receive signs or interpret signs that there is some kind of new page that can be opened.
Okay, so we are back. And what I thought, and the way I want to respond is there is one thing. You have, of course, a lot of parties involved in the conflict, but what I mean by saying that the West doesn't have a long-term strategy, I quite literally mean it, because if they had long-term strategy, they would really think about some type of reconciliation or some type of peaceful arrangement, but they actually don't think about it at all. So less, how can they ensure their victory, ensure that their principles and their way of thinking prevail, so to speak, rather than thinking about, okay, we have to reconcile both parties, or we have to kind of create an arrangement that is both suitable for Russia and suitable for Ukraine. And then they would have completely different thinking. And that's why we think that they don't have a strategy, long-term strategy. I mean long-term, like 20, 30 years down the road. And the way they try to think conflict now is mainly through how can they ensure that their, again, principles win. And by this I actually mean, how can they ensure that Ukraine joins NATO? And this is that's why it brings so not many complications, but I guess there is some unseen in the West, so to speak. And no one thinks about, again, I've never heard people talking about reconciliation as end goal to the conflict, for example. I have never seen this perspective.
Yes, because we have this kind of breaking news logic or social media logic where, we don't have profound analysis, where we have these kind of short snippets or sound bites of what people say, and you have also a repetition or almost mantra-like things such as Ukraine must win the war, Russia mustn't win the war. And if you really dig deep, most politicians won't actually give you a very profound answer, because, also they cannot know. So, I think in terms of underlining that principle is that of territorial integrity, of territorial sovereignty, that we cannot, in the 21st century, award a country or letting a country get away with conquering its neighbor and then simply amassing more, population, land mass, whatever. That's as such, I think, a perfectly reasonable principle. The question is just, how does that translate into political action, political reaction, and what kind of time markers are related to that? So, if we think about ceasefire, what is it that we then put in place? And I think for most, meaning NATO, Brussels, Washington, the OECD world, what have you, it is about the question whether one can actually negotiate or deal or cooperate with the Russia under Putin or not. And I think most would say no. And then the question is, what kind of character, what kind of regime will actually govern Russia after Putin? So of course, if you ask most politicians or policymakers what their wish is, I think certainly most would say not having Putin in power.
Yes,
but at the same time, nobody says we are actively encouraging or pursuing regime change, I think. But so then that brings us into a delicate situation.
Yeah, but then again, if you think about it, is a broader European security problem. It doesn't really matter whether Putin is in power or he's not. I mean, of course it does to a certain extent, but the problem is still there because it's not, he couldn't really boil down to just Putin or just like what they like to say, his imperial ambitions. There is something more to this conflict, so to speak, and that's just the arrangement of European security architecture. And then I see this like disconnect between the West and its, I would say, illusion that the West is still like the top dog in the system, and the reality on the ground, in the sense that, well, I mean, they couldn't really ensure territorial integrity of Ukraine. I mean, by this time, it's pretty clear. They couldn't really get Russians out of Crimea, or probably even Donbass, for that matter. So they have to come up with a certain thinking that is really transcends their thinking of now, in order to kind of also reinvent their own powers, so to speak. Because if they continue sticking to this delusional thinking that, of course, Ukraine must win and we have to ensure our own victory here, then they lose even more, because again, what we discussed in multipolarity terms, whatever Russia is doing together with China, together with the rest of the world, it seems that the rest of the world is moving somewhere, but the West is not. You know what I mean? So it is not really up to date with the changes. And I mean, and eventually it will come. I mean, I think it will come to the terms of the game, or it will come with the realities, or like the balance of power, so to speak. But if people in the West don't think through this perspective, then it will just maybe be detrimental to their long-term goals, ambitions, whatever. So this is why I think it's important. And then, of course, there's the question of, if we really think long-term perspective, like what the West wants for Russia, like what the place of Russia envisioned by the West. I mean, even if you can have the perfect type of scenario, and this is what I also mean by the fact that they don't really have long-term strategy. If they can have like the perfect type of world, what the world it would be now, like, and what is the place of Russia in this world? So is it that they want Russia to be just like its own thing? And again, like if you read through documents, it seems like they want to exclude Russia from Europe as such. Like, and you could definitely see it through like NATO expansion thesis, like open door policy, because in documents they say that they want to have like Europe free at peace, but it really means that they exclude Russia, in a sense like the Europe ends where the Russia starts, something like this. Or do they want to have what exactly do they want? What is the ideal type of scenario for Russia in this Western type of system? Because I think this is like where the problem starts, so to speak. So for me, it's actually where all this European security architecture kind of crumbles, or at least it has some. They need to think through it. Well, that's what I would argue. And then it comes back to the question of how could you ensure that, okay, both Russia and Ukraine are satisfied, because that's the only way to reconciliation and some sort of long-term peace or peaceful coexistence, the way I call it.
But I mean, this will be still a long way to go, especially if you think about it in institutional terms. If you talk about a security architecture, that is something that is backed up by institutions. If you think about, we just have clear borders and we have also mutually agreed sort of resolution of territorial claims and things like that. I think that would already be that. I also don't see that at the moment. So I guess what is missing is some kind of blueprint for, these are the kind of red lines or guardrails or criteria under which the West is able to imagine, able to implement some kind of rapprochement towards Russia and or some kind of future European security architecture. At the moment, NATO and you primarily see European territorial integrity, and especially that of Ukraine, of course, threatened by Russia, I think, for obvious reasons. And therefore, there you have this logic that any kind of gesture of goodwill actually could be read as weakness by the Kremlin, and therefore I think it's also a bit far-fetched or unrealistic to think that there is such a blueprint that already being discussed. So again, I come back to that point where I guess there are at least scenarios that are somewhere hidden behind closed doors that exist for such a long-term strategy, but it's certainly too early to come up with such a long-term strategy. That you have someone testing the waters and maybe a retired politician saying, well, in order to really have a European continent, we somehow have to find a new way to deal with Russia. I think that's something people might say at some stage, but I mean, in what kind of political action activities that is then being translated? I mean, that's the big question. And I think that is something where, again, we see rather massive pull to the extremes, or we actually have a situation where this is becoming less on both sides. I mean, again, if you have Kim coming to Moscow, I mean, it's also symbolizing.
He came not to Moscow, but to Vladivostok.
Okay, yeah. Well, okay, but I mean, he met Putin.
Yeah,
in Russia. He came to Russia. So yes, apparently he loves to travel by train, right?
Yeah.
So
it would be
the way was of course shorter. But I mean, I think that of course is something that Russia, or Putin, or the Kremlin likes to send a certain message. And I mean, both sides send messages, and they are actually making it less likely that there will be some kind of European security architecture in the near future. So, I mean, the question is, how could that come about? And I mean, that's maybe a question for the next podcast. Yeah. How are security architectures actually? How are they maintained? Are there changes to a security architecture? Because I mean, as such, we do have blueprints, right? I mean, we could go back to the OSCE, 1990. We have this idea. Germany. I mean, there are so many instances where we had this idea of something ranging from Lisbon to Vladivostok. That's an often used term.
Again, go back to the end of the Second World War, an idea. Well, I guess like the European World War is based on a certain type of ideas that, you know, you forgive Germans for what they did, you disconnect German Nazi regime from German people, and you give German people a chance to, and I mean, you quite literally give them opportunity to grow, to enrich themselves economically, and all of the type of thinking, you know, led to a type of peaceful environment that you have now. And what, of course, I argue. And then, of course, I'm pretty sure if you go back in time, there were a whole bunch of ideas there. And of course, ideas to repeat the same type of Versailles type of agreement where you put down Germany even more, let's say, right? Because, I mean, they also could ensure that because they won. And that's the same type of... I also think, I guess the important point to make that it will be, again, probably the clash of ideas. It's not like you can say one type of ideas are better than another, but you know, you have to kind of prove yourself, and you have to argue, you have to have a good argumentation why this thinking is better than that thinking, because however this war ends, or however like the peace settles, you will have different type of ideas, and like, you know, one camp would definitely argue that you have to exclude Russia even more. And if you can, you have to like put it really down, and you have to really go into this Versailles type of thinking. Oh, and there are going to be some people who say, let's let's do the type of things with Germany. Let's integrate Russia. Let's give Russian people opportunity to engage economically, and let's create some type of space that includes Russia and Ukraine, so they won't have fighting in the future for those type of lands, whatever. If Russian and Ukrainians could travel freely to each other, lands, capitals, and the question of Crimea.
Not something that they want to do at the moment, I guess.
No, not at all. But I mean, that's the same type of questions that Germans and French had when they fought zealously for those coal enriched regions, so to speak. For them, it was also the question of death. Who controls those coal enriched Alsace and Lotharingia territories, so to speak. And now, no one really cares. And the whole European cooperation started the idea that you need to have something like this, so you won't come back to this rivalry in the future. So I guess that's up for debate, right? And up for us to kind of make some contribution. But this is why I think it's way much more important to think about reconciliation than to think about just how to end the war, because reconciliation actually means that you have 150 million people, and together with I say, if you include Russia and Ukraine, 100 million people living in peace, which contributes to better life conditions in the world and stuff like this, which is obvious thing. It's important to even just force you to think through this lens rather than to think, okay, who wins? Because then you're playing this geopolitical game. You don't think about real implement, so to speak. So I guess that's...
They will have to include civil society. That will have to be a process that is at the level of wider society, not only at an elite level.
Yeah.
The question is, must it driven? Should it be elite driven? At this moment, with the current elites, at least in Russia, it's unimaginable.
But you also...
And the question is, how of course, if you easier to travel, if you make it easier for people to meet, and that is eventually something that should contribute to an improvement of the situation. I think that will need a podcast in more than a decade, I'm afraid.
Sure, many more podcasts. But also it's good to just to try to develop even those ideas, because again, I don't think people think about it enough, or they think about reconciliation at all at this stage, because I guess still very early in war period. So hope to talk to you in the future about this, and I guess let's keep it in our mental closet.
An agenda for Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Interesting idea.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Dimitri.
Thank you, David.